So yes, so if anybody wonders, I'm not in Beijing and I'm not at the Summer Palace. It's just a picture that's in the background. I'm in Philadelphia, so no travel. So nobody should get jealous that I'm under a blue sky in the Summer Palace. No, it's not. So yes, thank you everybody for joining, and particularly thank you for Claire for making sort of snuff bottle history with this Zoom seminar that we're starting off with today. I think it's very exciting since we really don't have the ability to get together this year, and hopefully we can kind of return to a more normal format next year. But in the meantime, we kind of want to use what technology has to offer and try this virtual format in form of these Zoom seminars. And I think a little bit of a ground rule, I mean, maybe most of us are familiar with Zoom or doing and have done it with family and friends and so forth. I think
not to video. Yeah.
Okay. So I think what Julia is going to do once Claire starts is she's going to mute us all so that we don't have any background noise and we can hear Claire, you know, only, and we don't have any pets or anything else in the background, which might disrupt the conversation. It is a seminar style, so Claire is encouraging questions, but you should submit them through the chat feature. Julia kind of will keep track of the question, and then there is going to be a pause after each segment of the seminar. I think Claire has a number of segments that she wants to cover. After a segment is over, she will kind of signal us that, you know, now it's time to ask your questions. Julia will kind of keep track of, you know, first come, first serve, right? So you will be unmuted to ask your question. Claire will give her answer, and, you know, and hopefully we will keep that maybe to a 5-10 minute segment so that we can stay within the format. With that said, Claire, do you want to add anything before we begin?
No, I just want to say welcome to everybody and how absolutely thrilled and excited I am to be doing this. I managed to get up at 6:30 to walk my dog and everything so that I could be here, but I really appreciate, I know there are people here from Asia. I know
Claire, you got muted.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. I was just
perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was just thanking everybody in Australia and Asia who has stayed up late to be part of this, and those of you in Europe and England who are giving up their Saturday evenings. I don't know what we're giving up at this point, but welcome everybody. So let's get going. So what I want to do today, and I deliberately wanted to do this as a more interactive seminar rather than a formal lecture so that people can ask questions. I'm going to be talking about the SUZHOU School, and in particular what we look at when we see SUZHOU School bottles, what's there in front of us. And so that is why the title refers to the SUZHOU School and its kissing cousins, because there are related groups of bottles that pictorially and stylistically look very similar, and I will get to those at the end of the seminar. So let's get started. I'm going to first talk about the sort of history behind it and dating and materials. So in the 18th century, Suzhou, Hangzhou, and Yangzhou, all neighboring cities, were very, very wealthy. In fact, Yangzhou was one of the wealthiest cities in the world in the 17th and 18th century because of the salt merchants who were there. Oh, hang on. That's okay. I was just figuring out how to move my slide on. SUZHOU was known as a center for jade carving, which was already established and flourished from the late Ming dynasty onwards. Zhuanzhu Lane in SUZHOU was the artist's quarter. Now, I want to stress here that these workshops, for the most part, were commercially oriented workshops. And they were catering to their wealthy patrons who lived there. Jade carvers also worked on hard stone bottles, such as agate bottles and more rarely crystal bottles. So the first two bottles I showed, I'm not quite sure how to, oh yeah, I can get back. There we go. The first bottle that you see on your, I'm not sure if you see it on your left or your right actually. So I'll just say the black and white jade bottle that you see shows the Tang Dynasty scholar, poet and recluse, Meng Haoran, and he's traveling through a mountainous landscape with his attendant, and his attendant is carrying a branch of prunus on his back. Meng Haoran was an official who did not do too well at the imperial court, and he was forever trying to pass the imperial examinations, and even when he passed, he would do something not so good and be banished from the court. And so he was always trying to get back. He's normally seen in these winter scenes, and the prunus branch is the flower that is the first flower that blossoms in the winter. So it's a sign of hope. So I thought this was a very good slide to start with, as a good bottle to show. And the agate bottle seen there also has Meng Haoran with his attendant, and his attendant's also carrying a branch of prunus. You can see that, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see that there's an inscription on the top corner of that agate bottle. And what's very interesting, I'm going to point out as we go along, features of the bottle that are a bit different from the normal SUZHOU bottles. And in this case, what I would like to point out is the pine tree on the neck of the SUZHOU bottle. So we'll come to this later, but just note that feature is there. I want to talk about the dating of SUZHOU school bottles, because we tend to very easily say that bottles are 18th century if they're spectacular. And I find that's not always the case. Unlike the imperial archives, which provided documentation at the palace for bottles, we have no records for SUZHOU school bottles. Most of what we can surmise about these bottles actually comes from remarks or poems that the Qianlong emperor made about his liking or dislike of the pictorial style of jade carvings, and not specifically related to snuff bottles. So there are, and if you want to know more about this, Yang Boda wrote an amazing article, which I still think is one of the best on this subject, in Arts of Asia in March, April 1992, when he talked about the Emperor Qianlong's collection in the Palace Museum. Hugh talks about 2 stages of SUZHOU carving, and he talks about an early first phase, which he says is mid 17th, early 18th century, and they are not easily recognizable necessarily as what we think of as SUZHOU school bottles. And I'm not going to concentrate on that first phase because I think it needs a lot more research. Essentially, they are the very brilliant white jade bottles, which have subject matter of flowers, and they're very minimally carved. They don't have the typical elaborate attributes that we associate with the SUZHOU school. And in agate, there really isn't this first phase. What he calls the second phase, from the mid 18th to the mid 19th century, is really what I'm going to talk about here, and is what you're going to be shown. So there are, to my knowledge, only 2 dated bottles from the SUZHOU school. One is in agate and one is in jade. I don't have slides of either of them. The jade bottle is a black and white jade bottle, so similar to the one shown here, in a collection in Hong Kong, and was sold at Sotheby's Hong Kong in 1994. If you want the lot number, it was May the 5th, 1994, lot 1496. And that was signed probably with a collector's name rather than a maker's name, the signature Wang Yun, with a seal on it, Yun, and it was dated with a cyclical date to winter 1792. So because it's a cyclical date, it could be 60 years earlier, which is very unlikely, or 60 years later. So it could be 1852, winter 1852. But Hugh's going for winter 1792, so I'm going to agree with him. And then he has in his collection an agate bottle, which has a relief carved Tongzhi rain mark. So that is 1862 to 1874. So that places it squarely in the mid-19th century. If we're looking at the earlier sort of date of the mid-18th century, after the conquest of Turkestan, which was in 1759, the supply routes of raw material of jade opened up, and it remained that way until throughout the early 19th century. I think given Hugh's bottle with the Tongzhi rain mark, we can say that the tail end of SUZHOU production was probably around the time of the Taiping Rebellion, which was 1851 to 1861. Although, Hugh's bottle, which is dated between 1862 and 1874, shows that they could still do really, really good work at that point. And we always think of glass making and jade carving and everything is going completely downhill during the Daguan period. But Hugh's bottle shows that that's not entirely the case. So do we have any questions at this point yet? Julia? I can't hear you.
No questions so far, just we want to let you know that we can see your cursor and we also see the pictures the way you do. So
oh, great.
You can point out left and right and stuff, so we're good.
Okay, that's
If anyone has a question, please submit it at the chat on the lower side of your screen.
Okay, so I want to go on to talk about what we mean by the pictorial style, which is the style that the SUZHOU school bottles are carved in. After 1787, when the supply of raw materials was coming through, the Qianlong Emperor, he vacillated between saying that these pictorial styles were too kind of frilly and elaborate and were not what was acceptable at court, to saying that the carvers were carving away too much of the raw material of the jade and that they should use the natural inclusions. So the carvers at the palace, and then this filtered out throughout China, the carvers took this to mean that they could go ahead with this pictorial mood. So his newfound liking for this style filtered down to SUZHOU, and we'll talk about specific bottles, and we'll see how this shows up in SUZHOU school bottles. So here we have a bottle with on the right hand side, using the dark inclusions, the dark brown inclusions, a sage. He's at sort of 3 o'clock, a sage seated, and he's seated under a wutong tree. His attendant is beside him, and they're seated. I don't think you can see this on the back more easily. There's a balustrade, and then there's these scrolling clouds coming out of what is a water well. And we know that that's the case because there's an inscription on the right-hand bottle on the shoulder, which is basically the title for the bottle. It says, seated and watching clouds come out of a well. So there's really no doubt what this means. And in jade, we see this pictorial style in something like this SUZHOU jade pebble, where the cloud scrolls are coming up from vapors, actually on the right-hand side of the bottle in the left-hand picture. And we see a sage, 2 sages and his attendant. One is holding a fan. And on the other side, 2 boys pointing at a bat and a pine tree. And they're standing on serrated rockwork. This has all the elements of a SUZHOU school bottle in terms of style and carving and subject matter. And you'll start to notice that when I'm describing these bottles, I'm using the same subject matter all the time, because there's a commonality which flows through all of them. So let's look at the shape or form of these bottles, because that's important. As always, I'm going to give you a general set of rules, and as always, there are exceptions to these rules. So we see bottles which are generally rounded or ovoid form. They have no foot rims. They generally have a plain cylindrical neck, and they use the maximum use of space for their design. You'll notice that the bottle shape is very symmetrical, and I think the reason for that is that whether the design is continuous or around the bottle, or whether there's, which it often is, or whether the design has a scene on one side and a different scene on the other side, there's no distraction from the subject matter caused by the form of the bottle. There's no real frame for these bottles except at the mouth and at the foot. In fact, I think whether to have a continuous scene or to have 2 sides set with separate scenes, it tends to be dictated by the natural inclusions in the bottle than by the shape. Something else that needs to be pointed out, we always think of high quality stone bottles as part of the measure for their quality would be how well hollowed they are. But this is not the case with SUZHOU school bottles. And I've thought about this a lot over the years, because many, when you show people SUZHOU school bottles, they pick them up and they say, oh, but this is a little bit heavy. And that's the reason is because the walls are quite thick. And I think the reason for that is the way the workshops, the system of the workshops meant that you had different groups of people cutting and hollowing and polishing. So they would leave the walls thick so that the carver could really carve something which was three-dimensional and sculptural, and he had enough of the stone to be able to do that. I think that's one of the differences between the first phase, where you tend to find bottles which are more well hollowed, and this second phase, which we associate with the SUZHOU school. I would point out also that that often SUZHOU school bottles have a very narrow mouth, and it's not like glass, where glass is blown and a wide mouth is harder to control. With stone bottles, it's harder to hollow it out if it has a very narrow mouth. So the people the workshop who are making these bottles are paying attention to that fact, despite the fact that they've left the walls thick as a conscious choice. You see something similar actually in 18th century imperial palace bottles, where the walls, the hollowing might be thin until you get to the base of the bottle. And then often you find about a fifth of the bottle's height is not hollowed out inside at the base. And I think that's to weight the bottle down. So here we have a bottle which is very unusual in that the normally when you have these black and white jade bottles in the SUZHOU school, it is the white jade which forms the highlight rather than the ground. So in this case, you have a bottle which is essentially a white jade bottle with this highlight of a black inclusion on the side. And this shows you a, where's my cursor? This shows you a sage seated here in front of an incense burner. His attendant is to one side. And then they're sitting underneath a massive rock here with pine trees overhanging them. And then on the back you have, the scene continues, and you have a deer standing by the rockwork. There is a raised inscription on this bottle with two seals, so that the inscription reads, again is a title for the bottle, the formula for the elixir of life is in sitting itself. So that is to say, if you just sit down and, contemplate, you will find, to do your meditation, you will find the formula for the elixir of life. It has two seals on it which say Zi Ting, and I want to bring this up because this is very important. Hugh has retermed SUZHOU school bottle Zi Ting school, and so I know that somebody's going to ask that question, so I'm going to deal with it right off the bat. There are only 4 snuff bottles known and 2 pendants which have the seals of Zi Ting on them, and this is one of them. We don't know anything about Ziting. We don't know if he was the carver of these bottles or if he was a patron of collector, a collector of bottles and a patron of the workshops. My thought is that he was a patron, and that Ziting was a collector of snuff bottles and other small objects. This signature either appears as two seals as it does here, or on one of the other bottles in relief draft script. But there's no documentary evidence that he was a carver. Nothing is known about him. But he turns up on some very good bottles. So that's why Hugh calls it the Ziting School. So we can use either name for it. This is one of the black and white jade bottles, which are so wonderfully carved, generally in the SUZHOU school. It's carved with two boys. One is holding a mythical beast, the upper boy, and the boy is looking at it. And they are surrounded by a frame of convoluted rockwork at the bottom and a pine tree, and then some cloud scrolls. And on the back is incised in draft script a treatise on calligraphy, the Shupu, by Sun Guoting, whose dates are 648 to 703. And this also has on the left-hand side here the name Xixiang, which means stone fragrance, with one seal here. Again, Yun as the seal. This bottle is a slightly unusual group, one of the black and white group, in that you can see that it uses the black or grey part of the stone and the white part of the stone in the same plane. It has on both sides a sage and his attendant, and on one side the attendant is handing the sage a duck, and on the other side there he's seated and he's looking at the duck in the water. So, any questions so far? Or is everybody?
Yes, we do have questions. Can the CD identify itself, please? Unmute. I'm not sure who CD is. CD, can I unmute you? I send you a request.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, do you want to ask a question?
Sure, I put it in the chat. Is there any estimate of how long it took to create a bottle of this type? Days, months, years?
So yes, that's one of the things I looked at, and obviously these bottles are very elaborate. They were part of, it was a sort of what I call a many hands project, each bottle. So that you would have, and it was often families and generations of families that worked in the individual workshops. So you would have a master carver who did the design and the fine carving, and then you would have his assistants who would do cutting and polishing and hollowing. Obviously, because it was a commercial workshop, they would want to produce bottles as quickly as possible. So this sort of many hands approach reduces the time. So the estimate is that a bottle would take 2 to 3 weeks to make, as opposed to months if just one person was doing it. And you may well have bottles that, 3 or 4 bottles that are orders for their patrons on the go at any one time. But I would say 2 to 3 weeks it would be a good answer.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Henrik?
Yeah, I just had a very basic question. I'm wondering if these were made as artwork, sort of commissioned as artwork, or really with the intention of using them. I guess it's very unclear.
You know, with all snuff bottles, we know that from the, I think of snuff bottles as a top-down art form, and by that I mean that the snuff bottles, the use of snuff bottles and the collecting of snuff bottles both started in the imperial palace, and we know that various emperors used snuff. We know that the Yongcheng emperor used snuff. We know the Qianlong emperor used snuff, and various princes. And then because of their influence, that filtered down towards the educated elite and the wealthy people who, for example, lived in places like Suzhou and Yangzhou. So I think these bottles were made for use and for collecting. We know, there's the classic story of He Shen, who was the sort of the not the prime minister, but the top official for Qianlong, had over 2,000 snuff bottles, and that he did use snuff, but they also collected them at the same time. So my answer to you is yes, both. They were used and collected.
Then Susan asked a question that was actually answered by Dessa. Susan, you want to evaluate on that? You have to unmute yourself.
But I did wonder, Claire, why you think it's 2 to 3 weeks it took to make a bottle. Why do you think that is?
Well, basically everything I've read on that subject, it seems to concur that is the length of time that it takes.
Wow.
Yes, I know, a long time.
It would take a lot longer in that there seems so much detail, but
yes, I think I think it takes longer to make and carve a stone bottle than it does to blow and carve a glass bottle.
Yeah.
And I think they're different lapidary techniques, and with a glass bottle, I think you have to, once you start carving, you have to kind of keep going. And with a stone bottle, I think you can carve some and go away, and then come back and pick up the tools and carve again.
Yeah.
So what did Dessa say?
Well, it was the other question was what was the date of the Yang Bo Da article? But,
right, but she answered.
And can I ask another question, which I haven't put on the chat? We always talk about how, somebody saw the stone on his bench and he turned it around and then saw a pattern in the stone. Do we think that's right, or do we think that there was a set of subject matter that SUZHOU carvers wanted to do, and so they sort of fit the subject to the stone, if you see what I mean?
I think for the SUZHOU carvers, I think that they fit the subject matter to the stone.
Okay.
Because you see these commonality of features throughout. And this slide that I'm showing now is a great example of this, actually. That I think the carver had the workshops had a set of designs, but it was, very much, we'll put rock work here, this would be great for a pine tree, that kind of thing, because the features on these bottles are so specific. But when you get to something like a silhouette agate bottle, then
Yeah.
I think it's a different, and then I think the opposite is true, that and I always use this phrase that Noguchi used about his sculpture, that he cut a moment in the stone. And I think for silhouette agates, that's what they have to do, because if they cut one way too far, they
Yeah.
lose the design. And if they don't cut far enough, they can't necessarily see the design. And you know, the best silhouette agates, I mean, this is a bit off subject, but the best silhouette agates are the ones that have an obvious design, but the surface is very smooth. It's not a forced design. But in the case of SUZHOU School, I think that's a very good point that you raise, that they would fit what is in front of them, the design, onto that.
Yeah. Thank you.
One last one from Alvaro. Alvaro, would you like to unmute and ask your questions? You know how to unmute? We
Bottom
can't
left
hear you. Go to your lower left corner of the screen. There's a little microphone.
Okay.
Here we go. Perfect. Yes.
Good morning. Were there any restrictions or regulations regarding height, depth, and width when these particular bottles were produced?
Absolutely not, because it was all a commercial workshops. So it really depended on the availability of the material.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. That's it for now.
Okay, let me move on. If I can bring up my, oh, no, I want to go, sorry, I want to go back to that other bottle. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk about color and the use of natural inclusions at this point. So with the SUZHOU School, every part of the stone, including the natural inclusions, are used by the carver to produce this three-dimensional sculptural effect. And one of the ways they did this, and one of the ways they created perspective, was the use of multiple planes of carving. And often the natural colors in the stone lie in the different planes. One way of doing this was using undercutting, so that they would take one area where there's a color and cut away underneath it to produce some relief work, but not too much. Another thing people often say to me is that, you know, oh, this feels sharp. Why does this feel sharp? And if it's a SUZHOU School bottle, well, that's because it's deliberately undercut in that way. Historically, we find that because of Qianlong's remarks that it wasn't necessary to carve away the natural flaws, which I mentioned before, there was historically an acceptance by the Chinese that the use of stones that are less than perfect is absolutely fine. This is slightly this acceptance has slightly gone away these days, because people tend to like pure white jade bottles, and they say, oh, they're mottled, or they've got a flaw through them or something. But historically that was not the case. So generally you see, and I think I sort of mentioned this, when you have agate bottles, it's the dark inclusions that are used to highlight the stone against a lighter color ground. And with jade bottles, it's usually white against a black or gray ground. Or when the russet skin is used, it's the russet skin against a white ground. But essentially, it's what's ever the most effective to provide a picture where there's as much contrast as possible. So this bottle is, and I'm going to try and show some bottles now which are unusual colors for this school. So this bottle is, I think, is absolutely wonderful. It has a sage scholar actually, sorry, and he's fishing. I don't know, let me see if the cursor, there's his fishing rod, and he's fishing under a plantain tree. And then on the opposing bank of the river, there are pine trees and wutong trees, and this serrated rockwork. And on the other side, which I don't have, there's an attendant making tea for him, and an inscription. And the inscription says, again, it's a title, "A scenic spot hidden among pine trees and streams." So this bottle I consider to be one of the best Suzhou School bottles in the world. It's a green color, an olive green color with white inclusions. And it's very heavily undercut. It's very sculptural. There's a hunter on horseback chasing a deer on one side by pine tree, and then the other side is this serrated rockwork which folds over each other, and just an absolutely stunning thing. Here's an agate example where they've used the outer russet skin of the stone to highlight the hair on the monkey and on the horse. And the monkey has got hold of the horse. He's on a rock and he's pulling the horse. And that is symbolic of the idea of may you be appointed to a high-ranking position. I did once ask Hugh, like, how something could be both official school and Suzhou school, and he said, well, whichever you think would be best, pick one, because, you know, this would come under both of those groups. This bottle is highly unique for the Suzhou school, and is a very, very mottled, cream-colored stone with the use of the skin to highlight this long-tailed bird who's perched actually on a branch of lingja here. And the carving of the branch goes onto the foot rim, which is also very unusual and obviously deliberate. On the other side, there's sort of circles, increasing radiating circles of rockwork. And you can see that up here, this is not a crack. You can see that this is an inclusion in the stone, and they've used that as part of the rockwork. So we've talked a lot about subject matter, but I want to go and talk about it in more detail. So almost without exception, the subject matter on Suzhou school bottles are natural subjects. There are figures such as scholars, sages, and fishermen. There are the animals that we've seen, ducks, monkeys, horses, other kinds of birds. And then more rarely, there are mythical figures like immortals. Occasionally you see Shi Wangmu, who's the goddess of the West, come up. And you see, when you have immortals on snuff bottles, as is in fact on this bottle shown, you often see cranes as well. So even though they're not, they're mythically symbolic, I guess you would say. There are landscape or riverscape scenes, and very specific trees for some reason. Pine trees, probably the most popular, the wutong tree, plantain, and willow. I really haven't found any other kinds of trees. You also see very dramatic rockwork. And the rockwork seems to divide into three types. You get this folded over rockwork, where one rock is basically in front of another, but it looks like it's been folded over. You get serrated rock work where there are little dashes which are evenly spaced along the edge of the rock. And interestingly enough, even when you have larger jade carvings in the same pictorial style, you never see serrated rock work. You only ever see serrated rock work on small carvings occasionally, but often on snuff bottles. And I don't know whether this is because the snuff bottles were all made in one workshop, or it was just too much work to do serrated rock work carving on bigger pieces. I don't have the answer to that. And then you have what we call convoluted rock work, which is the rock work that emulates the SUZHOU rocks that with holes through them, the rocks that were pulled up from Lake Tahoe. The other thing that it often occurs on SUZHOU school bottles, and I would say is almost a signature along with the rock work, are the scrolling or looping clouds. And you often see those as a collar around the neck around the shoulders of the bottles. And that feature seems to take its inspiration, as does a lot of this subject matter actually, from transitional period blue and white porcelain styles. So on this bottle, we have two immortals here, and on the other side, you can't see so well, but there is a figure on a horse entering a walled fortress or a walled city. And then on one of the walls is an inscription here. This white jade bottle shows a sage seated on a rock. And again, so you've got these very rock work that folds around each other on both sides of the bottle. And he's looking at a pine tree. There's linger there, and there's a crane up on, I think it's on this side. Where's the crane? I've lost the crane. But this rock work also has these serrated lines on them as well. This agate bottle has 3 robed figures and sitting under a pine tree. And again, you have this feature of the pine tree up on the collar, where they've used on the neck, where they've used the inclusion, the dark inclusion on the neck for the collar. And then on the other side, they've got a little scrolling cloud on the neck. So that's unusual. I mean, I've tried to find these unusual examples, and it does make it seem as though this happens more often than it really does. This is a black and white jade where, and this is a scene from the Dream of the Red Chamber. And the inscription on the back here makes that very clear. There is a monk, and he's being fanned by his attendant, and he's standing before a convoluted rock. So this is an example. You see the little holes here in the rock work. Here we have, on this agate bottle, we have Meng Hao Ren again. And I love this bottle because of its use of the inclusion in the stone. So, you know, to get back to what Susan was saying, that, you know, the carver probably would have been faced with this agate bottle with this sort of creamy russet inclusions. But the fact that he's produced such a fabulous scene out of this, with the prunus branch sort of floating at the top of the bottle, I just think is tremendous. I mean, the level of quality of SUZHOU School is just above most other agate bottles, which is why I guess the price is too. Here's another agate, more classic use of a honey-colored agate with dark brown inclusions, and a figure with his dog out in the hills, and then the pine tree up at the top, and again scrolling clouds. And here's a black and white jade with a monkey doing a handstand on Lingja fungus, or clambering. He's actually clambering over rock works. And then unusually there's bamboo and at the side here by the rock works, which doesn't turn up too often. And here another very natural scene of two horses grazing under a wutong tree with pine on the side, and then a raised inscription using the highlighted dark brown color. So whilst we're on subject matter, I want to talk about the very rare use of dragons on SUZHOU school bottles. Dragons appear very, very rarely. And when they do appear, they are not the formalized dragons that you see on the sort of white jade snuff bottles that come out of the palace, where they're confronting archaic dragons. You have dragons like this one that come from stories like of this is the dragon that this is the carp that goes along the Yellow River and leaps the dragon gate to become a dragon and goes off into the sky. And you see all these turbulent waves and everything. There's a lot of movement and fluidity in this bottle, which is totally different from the archaistic nature of the palace bottles. There were 8 imperial workshops that carved jade around the country, and I don't know where they all were. Maybe somebody like Dessa might know more than that. But I know that obviously one was in the palace, but one was in SUZHOU. And I know also that artisans were sent up from SUZHOU to the palace to work, and then they would return and go back to their commercial workshops. So the idea of having dragons on SUZHOU school bottles is not a strange idea. It just doesn't seem to turn up very often. The SUZHOU workshops were there to cater to their wealthy patrons. So they were using subject matter from their surroundings for the most part. But obviously there were still patrons who would have, despite being part of the merchant class, would have aspired to the sort of higher literati class. And, you know, something like this kind of bottle would show their friends how educated they were, that they would ask for this theme on a bottle that they commissioned. So before I move on to inscriptions and design, do we have any questions at this point?
Yes, we do. Henrik, you want to go?
Oh, sorry, before Henrik goes, I just want to point out a jade bottle that has a dragon on it. Just to finish off this subject. So this is a black and white jade. Here is a monk, and he's holding out an alms bowl to the dragon, and the dragon is flying through the clouds towards him. So, okay, Henrik, sorry.
I just have a very sort of basic question. It seems like that SUZHOU bottles were only made in jade and in agate. Are there any other materials that were used, or?
Yes, I showed at the beginning, I think it was the second slide, there was a hair crystal bottle with 3 goats under the sun. And I've also seen plain crystal bottles from the SUZHOU school, but again, very rarely. And when they do occur, they don't seem to be they don't seem to be clear crystal, because obviously that's not using, there's no inclusion to use at that point. So a hair crystal bottle would work for the SUZHOU school. And also I've seen there's a crystal that has almost, it's not a moss agate, it's a sort of smoky colored crystal, but it almost has little green inclusions over it, and that's carved in the SUZHOU school. But, you know, I mean, probably less than 10 examples that we know of. The rest are all jades and agates.
And then do we think that these workshops sort of produced anything else but snuff bottles? Because I know that there were sort of thumb rings that were sort of made in that similar type of black jade with the white, you know, sort of similar style. Do we know if they made other bigger pieces or only small pieces?
Well, I think that the majority of the workshops that made snuff bottles would make small pieces, like the thumb rings and pendants, which you see, and you know, objects to be handled. And one of my reasons for thinking that is the use of the serrated rock work, which you just don't get on the larger pieces. So I think it was, what we have to be clear about as well is that it is only the snuff bottle world that calls this style SUZHOU school, because there were many jade workshops in SUZHOU making all sorts of different styles, and not just for jades, but for hard stones too, because the same type of lapidary tools would have been used for hard stones. So I think that my thought is that there were certain workshops that did snuff bottles and small objects, and then there were other workshops where they didn't have to have somebody, for example, to hollow out something, would make the larger objects. But again, I don't have any documentation for that. That's just my thought.
All right, David is writing a useful comment. David, you would like to tell everybody?
Hello, good to see everybody. I just got on my other computer to look at Arts of Asia for March and April 1992, and those issues are not available if you wanted to purchase that article on Yang Putu for the SUZHOU school.
Okay, I'll if you email me, I'll send you a copy.
Lovely.
Not the actual issue, but I will do a scan of it and send it to you if you email me.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Perfect. Bob Copley, would you like to ask your question? Bob, you're unmuted. Where are you? You might have to turn on your microphone so we hear you.
Quick pro tip, if you hold down the space bar, it unmutes you temporarily.
Oh, no, he's muted again. Okay, I'll read the question. Is that okay, Bob? He wants to know if SUZHOU ever carved stoppers.
Ooh. I have no idea. Does he have one? I mean, it's possible, but you know, most of the stoppers tend to be coral or jadeite rather than agate or nephrite. But that would be interesting. I've never seen one, but if one turns up, please, everybody, let me know.
Okay. And Brian Spade, you want to ask your question?
Hi, Claire. I was wondering about the encryption, like the one on the bottle with the two horses on it. It seems like that would be exceedingly difficult to do by, carving the inscription out of the contrasting stone. How common is that?
It seems to be, I think inscriptions are incredibly hard to carve, whether they're in relief, raised relief, which must be harder, I think, to carve than incised inscriptions. But on these bottles, you see sometimes that I think I've shown a black and white jade where the back is completely incised with in draft script, which is very flowing and very well done. But it's not like you're writing it or painting it. They're carving it, and I think that takes a certain type of carver to be able to do that. I know that from what I've seen, all of the incised inscriptions in draft script, which are all on the black and white jade bottles, seem to be by the same hand. So, there's a limited amount of them, but it seems to be one carver who was able to do this very, very well and do it on the best of these bottles. So again, I would think that carver came out, and those bottles came out of one particular workshop.
Last question from Susan.
Yes. Oh, hi, Claire. My question was again, it was about the commissions that you obviously think most of the SUZHOU bottles were commissioned. And I wondered, are there any physical records of those commissions, any paperwork or whatever?
No, there's no documentation at all, which we would love, because the documentation would support some dating as well.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Because these were commercial workshops, I don't think they would. I mean, maybe they would make a few as samples, but they're not going to use something like this black and white jade that I'm showing now, which would be a very expensive piece of stone. I don't think they're just going to use it in the hope that somebody would come along and buy it.
Yeah.
These were very expensive pieces that had to have been very expensive pieces at the time that they were made.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's it for now.
Okay. So before I turn to related schools in terms of style and subject matter, which is a short ending to this talk, I just want to talk about a little bit about the use of inscriptions, and some of it we've covered actually, but essentially, and I've said this, the inscriptions usually act as a title for the piece, and they're very similar to paintings in that respect. You see on bottles collectors' names sometimes, or art names. So Wenwan, which means refined plaything, is a signature and seal. Both are used, which turn up on SUZHOU school bottles and on other bottles as well. There's a Master of the Rocks jade, which has the seal Wenwan on it. So that clearly, I think, is a collector's name. Then on SUZHOU school bottles, you sometimes see the signature Zigang, and that's an apocryphal signature. That refers to Lu Zigang, who was the famous late Ming jade carver from SUZHOU in the 16th and early 17th century. But he had died long before these bottles were produced. And his name also appears on non-SUZHOU school bottles as well, but usually always on jade. There's one in the block collection, in the block book. The first volume of block, and it's number 133, if anybody wanted to look at that. And I've just mentioned that the similarity of the draft script on the back of black and white jade bottles might indicate that they all came from the same workshop, because they seem to be done by the same hand. So this is a bottle where you have two immortals sitting down playing, and I think they're playing either way or go. And you have the attendant with his bowl of peaches, and sort of randomly this urn on a brazier, which is sort of a little bit floating in the air. And I mean, the design is still absolutely wonderful, and the bottle is stupendous. But I think this sort of really does answer Susan's early question about did they look at the bottle and decide what to do? Because the obvious thing would be to put this feature on a ground somewhere, and it's not. It's floating in front of a convoluted rock. But it's still a absolutely amazing bottle, and shows a lot of perspective in it. And so there's a saying that, and why people loved the immortals on snuff bottles, that a day of the immortals' life is 1,000 days of our life. So you have these stories of people standing in front of immortals, watching them, and then when they turn round, they find that anything that they have with them has sort of disappeared and rotted and fallen into the ground, which I love as an idea. Okay, this bottle is very, very, very interesting, because it's not the normal shape for SUZHOU bottles. It has a foot rim, which is very rare. It has an inscription, rather than to being one side, as it has the inscription as a central feature of the back of the bottle. Above that are the classic cloud scrolls, but on the other side, where the sage, he's actually holding out a white fan, which again is a great little feature on the bottle. But the frame at the top on the shoulders is the pine tree. So this inscription is a title. I mean, the sage is standing in front of a lotus pond, and his attendant is here. And the inscription on the back, it says, "Where on the pond no wind stirs the lotus, it's as comfortable as springtime." And then with the two seals, when one, refined plaything. So that saying, it sort of is a title for the bottle, but it's also taken from a 12th century poem by Wan Li, the poem entitled "Seeking a Place to Cool Off on a Summer Night." So it's interesting that they didn't use the title of the poem as the title of the bottle, but they used a line from the poem as the title for the bottle. This bottle I wanted to show partly because of the inscription, but if you look down here at about 6 o'clock, there's a crystal inclusion in the agate, which they've used as part of the rockwork. And it's got a scholar here and his horse kind of frolicking around. And then the folding rockwork which is also serrated, and also has the seals 1-1 on it, and an inscription which says, which I think might be from a poem as well, because there's no dragon on this bottle, but I think this might, the inscription says, the river water catches the wind and is transformed into a white dragon. And so down here, you have the river water, and then you have this crystal area, which is white. And so I think that's what they refer to as the white dragon, even though it's not a dragon. But again, once you delve into this bottle, absolutely fascinating. And the pine tree going up onto the neck as well. And here you have little monkey climbing on a pine tree. The pine again goes up to the neck using the dark inclusions. And on the back, it has an inscription where white clouds float. And then two seals, which I haven't seen before, Darwan, which means great enjoyment. So I want to move on to related schools. There's just 5 more slides. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to related schools?
No questions right now.
Good. Okay. So, you know, as I've said before, SUZHOU was not just a place where they made the SUZHOU school snuff bottles, but there were other workshops where very, very fine carving was made. And, you know, I'm not going to show you endless jade bottles, but I wanted to show this agate bottle because it has a lot of elements of SUZHOU school, but it's clearly not. You have the monkey pulling the horse out of the water, which we saw on an earlier SUZHOU school bottle. It is a continuous scene. It has the, you know, the scene finishes at the shoulders. It uses a lot of perspective. It has a scholar in the sampan playing his chin, and then a fisherman on the riverbank pulling up a fish. And if you saw this bottle in real life, the hood of the sampan really looks as though it's folding over. It has this amazing perspective to it. So there must be some sort of crossover of influence between the workshops in SUZHOU. I'm also quite fascinated by the double and triple overlays of the Yangzhou school, because, you know, Yangzhou was very near to SUZHOU, but they use pretty much all of the same features. So you have the cranes, you have clouds, you have rocks, you have nature, you have similar symmetrical forms, you have layers of overlays in the same way that you have multiple planes in the nephrite or agate. But you've got very different lapidary techniques. And, you know, the carvers of stone cannot carve glass bottles. Whatever anybody else tells you, it's an entirely different lapidary technique. There are entirely different tools used. It's a totally different area of manufacture and process. But you still have these very, very similar subject matters. So I wanted to show just 3 Yangzhou school bottles. I mean, here you have the birds, you have scrolling clouds around the neck. This is a triple overlay of green on ochre on pink on white. You have the same type of tree, scholars crossing a bridge, so you have a riverscape. You have down here a convoluted rock. So a very similar pictorial style to the SUZHOU group. And this one with horses, the 8 horses of Muwang, where you have the pine and wutong trees and the scrolling clouds as part of the ground, which is interesting, and as a double overlay. And then I want to finish very randomly with a cinnabar lacquer bottle. Because again, different technique of production, but the same kind of subject matter. And in all likelihood, probably, but not definitely, probably an imperial snuff bottle. This one is more interesting than many of these 18th century shield-shaped cinnabar lacquer bottles. It has the serrated rockwork and everything, but this one has been carved right down to the wood base, instead of having the normal brocade or diaper ground that you see. And this is obviously really absolutely intentional, because you have gilding on the wood ground. I'm pointing at it instead of using my cursor, but here you see the gilding here. So I was going to just read something that Craig Clunis actually wrote about these cinnabar lacquer bottles, but it fits with the SUZHOU school bottles and it fits with Yangzhou school bottles. And Craig Clunis suggests that in looking at pictorial scenes, we should be alert to possible connections in what may seem general genre scenes to specific major life events, as such pieces were used and reused among the elite to carry and themselves to be gifts on such occasions as a marriage, birth of a child, birthday, passing the imperial examinations, moving house, promotion, and retirement. Specific episodes from the history of famous literati or literature may be intended. In painting, such subjects are likely to be made clear by inscriptions, but not on lacquer. But as we saw, they are on SUZHOU school bottles. So there we go, guys.
Well, amazing. We have questions. Bob, I assume Bob Lee, is that right? Sometimes it's hard to say from the username. Would you ask? Would you like?
Oh, I think the questions I was asking was about feet. Several of the bottles that you showed have distinct foot rims. And I think there's a question of maybe about reproductions or imitations. When I was very young, it was almost impossible to find SUZHOU bottles. Bob Stevens, I think he searched the world, and I think maybe he was trying to fill a box of 10. But it was very, very difficult to find SUZHOU bottles. And during that period in the early 70s, I think people tried to imitate the SUZHOU bottles out of other bottles. The bottle that had that unusual shape that was near the end of the agate bottles, I think could possibly have been a bottle that they were trying to make into a SUZHOU bottle because of the way the calligraphy is done on one flat plane. And then nowadays there are many contemporary SUZHOU bottles, especially the black and white jades. Do you have any comments on those?
Yeah, I've seen, well, I think we've all seen numerous of black and white jade bottles coming up, which are, the stone is somewhat inferior to the original ones. I did hear somewhere, but I didn't want to include it because I don't really have any proof of this, but that all of the black and white jade pieces, the ones that are authentic, which are include other things like pendants and handling, small pendants, handling pieces, that kind of thing. They were, I read somewhere, I think that they were all made from the same large boulder, and once that boulder was used up, there was no more. So I think it's fairly easy to distinguish the authentic ones from the modern ones, the modern copies. There were, I remember there were in the 70s and 80s a large number of agate Suzhou School style bottles that were being produced. I think in Hong Kong maybe. And again, they are, once this has been pointed out, they're quite easy to distinguish from the authentic ones. But those do tend to have more use of foot rims and not the same adherence to the design features that I've talked about.
CRGHSE4, would you like to identify yourself and ask your question?
Who is that? I don't know.
Hi, this is Anne Chu. Hello, everybody.
Hi, Anne.
How are you? And thank you, Claire, for getting up so early to give us this wonderful talk. The reason I appear as Krigsy is because all my Zoom things had as Krigsy. So when I logged on, it wouldn't let me type my name.
Right, right.
My questions were actually pretty similar to what Bob was saying. And what I was saying was that with the increasing sophistication of the laboratory techniques and modernization, how do we go about telling the repros from the real McCoy? Well, you don't have patina or anything of that sort, or you don't have the wear on these bottles because most of us just put it up for display.
Right. I think the it comes down to, a lot of it comes down to provenance, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the price of the bottles is going to be higher, but just that you know where it came from. If it's been in, some people have their parents' collection, some people have their grandparents' collection. So you know when the bottles were acquired, and is always a help. If usually for me, for these bottles, if the stone seems to be a little bit unusual, then I would look twice at it. If there are features, I think I've covered fairly extensively all of the features that you find on SUZHOU School bottles. So if there's, if there was suddenly a formalized dragon with serrated rockwork, those would be two features which wouldn't really match up. Things like that. And so, generally, I always think that collectors know a lot more than they think they know. And if in your mind a red flag is raised, there's a reason for that. And so you should ask yourself, why are you questioning something? Why, and trust your gut instinct with it.
The second question I had was exactly somewhat similar to Bob's, and that was the last two black and white dragons that you had. Both of those had foot rims, and right. The techniques seemed as though, was that from a different workshop? Because I sort of missed out, I was walking around. So was it in Beijing or whatever?
They're all workshops in Suzhou, but I think there are just it's the same that I can give you a set of general rules for each different group of materials of bottles, but there's always going to be exceptions to those rules. I didn't touch on the fact that, for example, there's a number of SUZHOU School bottles that are, I think I mentioned it once, that are carved on the base, and that is not usual. Now, in some cases, and when I was doing my homework and reading up about all of this, in some cases, those would be additional.
Oh yeah, I didn't get your thing done yet.
Let me check what it might be.
I'll call you as soon as I do. Okay.
Oh, Bob, are you on? Okay, let's try again.
We don't want Bob Lee selling a bottle in the middle of this, do we now? So, you know, I did come across in my reading a SUZHOU school jade, which clearly was absolutely authentic. And the bottom of it had this sort of radiating pattern of lines, which I think, which didn't fit with the subject matter at all, and wasn't an extension of the subject matter. And I think that was a later addition. I also came across a SUZHOU school agate, which had a flat base, which had a yin-yang symbol on the bottom. And I think that was done later to cover, maybe to cover a crack or something, because again, it didn't fit with the subject matter. So, you know, you have to look at all of these things and make a judgment, I think.
Thank you.
Thomas, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi, Claire. Thanks very much for your Zoom lecture or Zoom talk, Zoominar, I guess it should be called. My question really was, because you showed one bottle which had a horse and a monkey, that to me looked much more like what I would just call a cameo bottle. How are you actually distinguishing between SUZHOU official school and just normal cameo bottles? Because some of the cameo bottles are quite intricate, and they do have work in the background as well as the, you know, the simple standout subject on the cameo.
Yes, and you often, you can find quite a number of agate bottles where you would see a monkey on the back of a horse and that kind of thing. But I think it's the, you know, and they were probably all made in SUZHOU as well in different workshops. But I think it's the addition of the things like the pine trees and the scrolling clouds and the rock work that differentiate one group of bottles from another. And so we're really talking about, you know, a group of bottles which have commonality. I mean, you know, maybe Hugh is right in reterming it the Zeeting school, because to call it the SUZHOU school is kind of a little bit disingenuous, in that almost all of these agates and jades would have been made in SUZHOU anyway, whether they were SUZHOU school or not. But it's the grouping together of certain features which make something SUZHOU or Zeeting school.
Right. I do have another question if there's time to get it in. A lot of the larger black jade bottles with a white have quite intricate inscriptions on the other side. And most of those are quite literary. And even a couple of the agate ones that you showed had a literary reference, but the large majority of the agate bottles seem to have a very simple like caption, which is just describing what the scene is, which is very simplistic and not aimed at an educated literati. I always thought those bottles were aimed for the more popular market, people with money, but not necessarily with the education. Is that the case? There seems to be a big difference between the two types of inscriptions.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. You know, I've showed quite a number of the black and white SUZHOU bottles because they're so stupendous, but there's really very few of them around, and they tend to be the ones that have those literati inscriptions. And I really think it was a case of, you know, the nouveau riche in places like SUZHOU, you know, wanting to, at a certain point, they want to emulate what's happening at the court, but they're part of the merchant classes, which are, you know, which were in the hierarchy much lower than the literati. But they had the money to have that pretension. So I think if somebody was well educated, they would be more likely to ask for something that made them seem more like a sort of scholarly merchant rather than just a regular person. But also you have this this knowledge that the artisans themselves went up to the court and worked at the court and then came back to Suzhou. So they would have, you know, in that case, they would have had knowledge of how the court operated and how the officials in the court also aspired to the literati lifestyle. So they may have, the influence may have come from them as well. And, you know, I did mention that certainly on the long incised draft script inscriptions on the black and white jade, all seem to be from the same hand. So, you know, I think it's a case of, you know, a wealthy merchant saying, well, you know, can I have something that makes me look a little bit more educated? And they would say, yeah, go to the workshop down the street because there's this guy that does these literati inscriptions. You know, I think it might be that kind of thing. But yes, I agree with you. Essentially,
Thanks, Claire.
Absolutely agree with you.
All right, let's try Bob Lee again. Bob, you have a comment? Bob?
Am I on or not?
You are, yes.
Oh, let me tell you a story about reproductions. Usually you can tell a reproduction pretty easily, but there was one case where I had a pendant, not a snuff bottle, and it was damaged. And one of these guys from China who comes over every once in a while who does jade carving said, oh, he has someone who can do repairs. And so I gave it to him. He took it back to China. And the next time he came back with the thing repaired, and it was a very nice repair. And then he also had reproductions of that thing. And usually you can tell the modern ones because the carving isn't the same. Even when they have a picture of something, they can't get the three-dimensional look to it. They can't copy from a picture. It's not true. But where they have an actual example of an old piece, they can do a pretty good job of copying it. So I think people have to really be very wary about modern bottles if they are at expensive prices.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's why I say that provenance is all important, and why I think it's very necessary for us as dealers to be very open about where something comes from, and you know, particularly in this day and age where everything seems to be going online because we have no other alternative. You know, it's very hard to buy a bottle online, you know, and know that it is authentic. I mean, it's just as difficult for me as it is for other people if you don't have it in your hand. You know, if you have it in your hand, you can hopefully tell and ask the right questions. But if it's just online, I think that you know, the auction houses and dealers, we all need to be as open as possible about where pieces come from and how long they've been in collections.
It seems that most of the black and white bottles don't have much provenance, even the spectacular ones.
Well, I would have to go back. I would have to go back to the block book and various things, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily correct. I mean, the obvious, there's many black and white fakes that turn up in small auctions everywhere. that, you know, I thought that they would eventually run out of them, material, but they still turn up. But it's usually very obvious. And you know, if something comes up in one of the major auction houses, there were a limited amount of them in the world. You know, they do turn up with provenance, and so that you can trust that for the most part.
Susan apologizes she had to leave, but she says, thank you, Claire, for an amazing talk. And Richard is our last question. Let's see if we can unmute Richard. Are you there? Richard, can you unmute? He says he has a comment on contemporary bottles.
Yeah. Following up on Bob's comment on the 70s, fake bottles, I was wondering how many carvers there were that did the actual carvings, because I was told from another dealer that all forgers have a certain signature that they like to leave, and he pointed out a certain distinctive carving style that forger left on every bottle that he carved, that if you look for that certain feature, you know that is fake. I mean, you know it's contemporary. And this one happened to be on the shoulder somewhere. And of course, I had the fake bottle that he pointed out and showed me what to look for. And so it was a very expensive but good lesson. But so there's a feature. I mean, are you aware of, I mean, like in contemporary art, I mean, all these forgers like to leave a certain signature, even on the general marks, you know, certain, when they incise the characters, there's a certain forger that had, I was shown, he left a certain tick that you have to know that it was made by him. So it's a fake. So I guess you have to look at a lot of bottles, but I was given those 2 pointers. So I was wondering if there were more.
I think that's really fascinating because, you know, I think any forger is a very good artist, and their natural instinct would be to do exactly what you've said. So I think, and for example, there are at the moment there are, and these are turning up in minor auctions. And again, I thought it would be a phase and then stop, but for the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, there have been imperial porcelain bottles with calligraphy on the back, turning up in minor auctions around the world. And they're very, very, very good. Once you realize that this is happening, then when a very good imperial porcelain bottle in immaculate condition turns up in the middle of Australia somewhere, you kind of wake up to it and look at it twice. But I'm sure if you could get all of those bottles together, you would find, I'm sure you would find that a feature somewhere, because they're all one-offs. You know, they're not, it's not like somebody's made 10 red faceted bottles, for example. They're all individually made and they're very, very good. And we've all been fooled. You know, we all have a black box somewhere hidden away that we try not to go to too often. So.
Great, thanks.
That is all the questions. If you would like to unmute and clap or scream, whatever you want to do, you're welcome.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Claire. Claire, would you like to announce the next date?
Yes, the next date will be July the, where is it? July the 25th.
Same time.
Same time, which is, hello. Hi.
And we want to thank you so very much. It was outstanding. And you were afraid it wasn't going to be going long enough. I think we've gone on very, very far. And we thank you again.
My absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
If you'd like to put on the website, feel free.
Shells.
Thank you.
From Elizabeth and Michael, thank you very much, Claire and Henrik.
It's brought a lot of pleasure for the day to all of us.
Yes. And me too.
Julia too. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for planning all this.
Yes.
Yeah, who needs a convention? We can just do this.
Yes, we do. It'll be a long time.
We should have this every week.
We should do that every week if Claire's up to it.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So
Thank you, Claire, again.
Picking your brains, Claire.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
I'm signing everyone
Bye-bye.
up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.